Okay, so we are less than 2 weeks away from the midterm elections in the United States. Now, the results of these elections are going to be really consequential because if the Democrats hold control of the Congress, then they will continue to try to put forward the agenda that President Biden was elected to do in 2020. On the other hand, if the Republicans take control of either the House or the Senate, in terms of new policy initiatives, it's pretty much end of story for the Biden administration. Now, it's not just the federal elections that matter, because in fact, there are a whole bunch of governor races and local races, and there are many ballot initiatives on state ballots this year that cover issues such as abortion, marijuana rights, voting, funding for public schools. So this is a big election. Now, here's what's interesting. Election campaigns, in many, many respects, are actually just negotiations. Now you might think, okay, that's kind of weird, but let me explain why. If you remember our definition of a negotiation, it's any communication between two or more persons with an intention to influence or to persuade. Now I hope you can see the connection because in fact, in an election, a candidate is literally negotiating with you. They are trying to communicate with you in a way to influence you or to persuade you to vote for them. And so as a result of this, it turns out that negotiation literature can give you a lot of useful guidance when you're thinking about for whom to vote. So in today's special video, I'm going to share with you 3 key lessons from negotiation that can help you filter through all of this endless advertising and mud throwing of the last 2 weeks before a campaign to help you make the best decision you can in this election. And stick around to the end when I'll share how to avoid a critical error that can mess people up when they're voting and when they're negotiating. I'm Bob Bordone. I'm a senior fellow at Harvard Law School. I'm the founder and former director of Harvard Law School's Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program. And I'm a principal at the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. Let's go. Okay, I'm going to start with lesson number 1 that matters in negotiation and also in elections. And it's this: prepare, prepare, prepare. We all know that those who prepare well in negotiation typically get better results for themselves, and they're better at identifying and obtaining mutual gains. Now, the same is actually true in voting. But what does preparation look like in voting? Well, it means taking more time to learn about the candidates than just listening to the 30-second advertisements that they or their surrogates might air on TV, or that you might see on Facebook or Instagram, or showing up in your mailbox. Truth is, many of these advertisements are filled with dramatic music, lots of mudslinging, and sometimes some empty promises. So making a decision about who your leader should be for the next 2 or 4 or 6 years based primarily on these ads is a really bad idea. Also a bad idea is just calling up some family member who you know is interested in politics and asking them what they think. They might be a good source of information, but they might actually not be that well informed either. So really good preparation means working to identify where a particular candidate stands on the issues, what they've said about these issues in the past, and not just what they've talked about in the last 2 months. Now, if the candidate is in office, it's actually worth taking the time to look at their past voting record to see if what they're talking about now matches up to what they actually said they're going to do. So consider this example where Senator Ted Cruz in an interview is talking about a highway being built in his state that he says will bring jobs to Texas and millions of dollars to the state. He definitely gives the impression that he is in favor of this highway. In fact, he even tweeted about this. But here's the problem. In fact, when the specific legislation came before the Congress for him to vote on it, he voted against it. So with respect to incumbent politicians, you can often see whether what they're saying is matching up to what they actually did. It's a little bit tougher with respect to challengers, but often there's still a lot of information that you can learn about them. For example, you could often check out both the incumbent and the challenger's website for a more detailed look at their policies. Now, if you go to their website and you don't see any policies listed or articulated with anything besides a bullet, honestly, that is a red flag. Alternatively, there are sites like Ballotpedia that offer extensive information about an individual candidate's stance on all of the issues. It's important to remember in voting that politics is actually about policy. So if you're investigating a candidate who does not have policies, if they're just a bunch of one-line promises, this is not somebody who's likely to be a really good leader. What about how to deal with ballot initiatives? Well, in many states, there are a lot of resources you can look to learn more about the issues. So, for example, sometimes a state secretaries of state office will actually have arguments on both sides of a ballot initiative made available to the public. But there are also other resources. So, for example, Vote Smart has a great ballot initiative tool that allows you to search and learn about every single ballot initiative in every single state in this election. Just go to their website. At this same site, you can also find info on candidates' past votes, on their positions, on their speeches, and on their sources of funding. What's most important, though, is that you spend the time preparing before you vote. In negotiation, we all know that if you don't spend time in preparation, you're very easily swayed and influenced by an empty argument, the use of emotion, exaggeration, manipulation. And the truth is, the same is in place for an election. Last word I want to say on preparation. It's not only a best practice that we can learn from the topic of negotiation, but I would say doing the homework, preparing before your vote, is actually part of all of our responsibilities as citizens in a democracy. Okay, so let me move on to the next tip. And the next tip is to remember both short and long-term interests. So we all know that before a negotiation, it's best to think about not just your short-term interests, but also your longer-term ones. In fact, negotiators who think about both short and long-term interests often negotiate better deals that are more sustainable and that keep them happier over the long haul. So the same is true for elections. And I know this is really hard because right now, inflation is very high, and so are gas prices. And so it's easy to pay extra attention to these highly salient short-term issues. And of course, short-term issues matter. It's also the case that if you're living paycheck to paycheck, inflation is really important. It's hard to focus on something that is a longer-term interest in that moment. On the other hand, to the degree you can do that, thinking about what is the good of my state or my country, not just in this moment, but down the road, that is going to yield a better decision in terms of your voting this election. The way nations are successful are not by making plans in an act-react cycle to every moment. In fact, nations that have really emerged as leaders are nations that have long-term strategic plans, whether it's with respect to national defense or education or climate policy. Think about the interests that you have in the next year or so, but also really think about the interests that you have for your country, for your children, for your grandchildren. And I think that will put a different angle on how you think about this voting. I see this come up all the time in negotiations, and sometimes in particular in a situation like a divorce. In a divorce, it's often the case that one or both parties are in a huge amount of emotional pain. The process of the divorce is extremely hard, extremely taxing. And so sometimes, especially if one of the persons in the couple is enduring more pain, right, they're willing to settle to get out of it because the short-term interest of exit is so high. Of course, then down the road, 5, 10, 15 years later, they might not have what they need to survive. So what I want to say here is, yes, you need to think about the short-term interests, but you also really do need to think about being sustainable in 5, 10, or 15 years. Okay, so for this third tip, we're going to talk about a psychological bias that's very, very present in negotiation and particularly in conflict situations, and that's often present in elections. And it's called loss aversion. So what is loss aversion? Loss aversion is the bias whereby human beings tend to experience the pain of losing something as twice as difficult as the experience of gaining something. So in other words, the thought of losing something we might value more highly than anything we might gain. And we see loss aversion being used in political advertising really all the time, but I would say in a very special way this year. So much of the political advertising is around fear. And this is happening on both sides of the political fence, right? Advertisements that say, if you elect this person, they will take your Social Security away. Or if you elect this person, they will take your abortion rights away. Or if you elect this person, our democracy will fail. Or if you elect this person, free speech will go away. Now, to be clear, elections have consequences. And in some cases, it is true that a candidate may be running to end abortion rights or to end Social Security. But the advertising tends to work particularly well because it is taking advantage of this loss aversion bias. And we need to be aware of that when we're making our decisions. You know, it's no wonder campaigns spend so much money telling you what you're going to lose if you elect the other guy than what you're going to get if you elect them. Loss aversion has led to another bias, which is called the endowment effect. So here's how the endowment effect works. In some of this research, participants are shown something like a coffee mug, and then they're asked how much they're willing to pay for it. And in some of this research, the average response was $2.87. Then they're actually given the mug, and they're later asked how much they would sell that same mug for. And the average response is $7.12. So what's happening here, right, is that when we have something, we actually value it more than how much we'd actually be willing to pay for it. So, what is the implication for you and me as a voter? When it comes to voting, first, be aware of this bias. And then, when you see advertisements that are trying to play on your loss aversion bias, take a step back and consider, how likely is it that this catastrophic consequence is actually going to happen? Let me give you an example. In my own state of Massachusetts, there is a ballot initiative right now that would require dental insurance companies to pay 83% of the premiums for direct healthcare costs. It turns out virtually every single medical organization in the state, the American Dental Association, Massachusetts Dentists, Massachusetts Hygienists, they are all in favor of this proposal. But thousands of dollars are being spent on ads that suggest that if you vote yes on this initiative, dental insurance will rise by as much as 38%, making dental care unaffordable for people. So here, right, loss aversion is being played big time. You are going to lose your insurance unless you pay 38% more if you vote yes on this initiative. But just becoming aware of this loss aversion bias helps you realize that this dire consequence that is being predicted, frankly, by dental insurance companies that are paying for the ads, is highly unlikely, if for no other reason, that an increase of the premium at that level would literally put the dental insurance company out of business because people would simply drop the insurance. Lastly, let me share a common negotiation error, one that has implications for all of us as voters, and of course for negotiators. And it's this problem: the tendency to make very quick assumptions that then lead us to make decisions that end up being erroneous. So in negotiation, right, one of the biggest errors that I'm always coaching people to avoid is that they can make a quick assumption about another's intentions, about whether a negotiation is entirely zero-sum, about whether they are being fair-minded, about whether the other side is being fair-minded. Now, those of you who have watched this channel and other videos know that these kinds of assumptions can get us really stuck in a negotiation. Because in fact, a lot of the time, one's intentions are not the same as the impact. So we may feel cheated or angry or betrayed or upset. But if we quickly assume that they meant it, or that they want to take advantage of us, or that they hate us, that can be wrong. We only know if we ask. Similarly, I've demonstrated in many of these videos that a negotiation that looks like it's zero-sum, actually, if we take a step back, we can make it multi-issue, spread risk across time, and find creative ways that make the negotiation actually integrating and not zero sum. Moreover, right, we know that by making assumptions about our own fairness in a negotiation, we can often get ourselves in trouble. This is why when spouses are asked what share of the household chores they do, the sum of their responses almost always adds up to more than 100%. So the point here is that when it comes to elections, it's easy to say, oh, that person is a Democrat. I know everything about them. Or that person is a Republican. I know everything about them. I know what they believe in. I know who they are. I know what they stand for. I know what they'll do. But I want to caution you against this because even in this highly polarized political moment, most people are more complex than their party label. And so this is why we come full circle, taking the time to look into each candidate's background, their values, their past experience, and their policy proposals instead of just assuming is as important in voting as it is in negotiation. So the midterm elections that are coming up are indeed consequential. In the next 10 or so days, many of us in the United States will be inundated with political ads. And these ads will try to get us to focus on our short-term interests instead of being wise and thoughtful and strategic about what is needed to make a country and a people great, safe, and secure. The ads will also try to tap into our fears and our loss aversion, giving us tales of impending woe about the horrible events that will happen if the other side wins. Instead, right, I want to invite you to think about what is possible if we extend the time frame and remain hopeful about going forward. So, using your keen negotiation skills and insights, you can avoid falling into these traps. You can prepare by researching issues and candidates thoroughly. You can think through and consider both your short-term interests, but also the importance of the long-term interests. Instead of focusing on loss aversion, focus on what is possible. This is what elections ought to be about in all events. The dreams, the hopes, and the possibilities for a better tomorrow, not just the fear of loss or destruction or chaos. And finally, avoid making the kinds of quick assumptions about who a candidate is and what they will do just based on a party label. If we see an election as a negotiation, it can also be a mutual gains experience if we do the hard work we need to do as voters. Please, no matter what you do, prepare, get out there, and vote. And before you vote, watch this next video, which is why are American politics so polarized? I'd be incredibly grateful if you could subscribe to my channel, like this video, and ring the bell. I'm Bob Bordone, and thanks for negotiating. Okay, you know you want to binge on politics and polarization. Keep watching.